growing in size. This means that more and more locals will face displacements and relocation if this second expansion project is approved. In my opinion, there should be more strategic planning and thorough research looking into the socioeconomic impacts that local communities will be facing as a result of these expansion projects. The location of my study is called Nyabigomi. It's an area within the Kinigi sector of Musanze district. Consists of multiple small and fragmented villages located on the edges of park boundaries. This area also makes up for the most densely populated zone in the country. As you can see from this picture, farming land spans to the very edge of the park entrance. This is the park entrance right here. And without any buffer zone, this means that these villages provide direct entrance into the park, but also extremely vulnerable to any human-wildlife conflicts or any emerging park policy. Similar to the rest of Rwanda, the economy is predominantly agriculture here. The climate and ecology makes for very fertile volcanic soil and predictable rainfall, very ideal for agriculture activities. The main cash crops are potatoes and pyrethrum, but the majority of the communities still rely on subsistence farming and livestock herdings as the main livelihoods. All these factors mean that locals are extremely vulnerable to climate change and land scarcity as a result of population growth and the park expansion projects that I mentioned earlier. And even though ecotourism has significantly reduced illegal extracting of resources inside the park, some still argue that these activities still persist in the present day. And additionally, it's remained unclear whether the benefits of the tourism revenue sharing program sufficiently contribute to community development and actually reaches the most financially vulnerable and impacted parts of the community. Since my project focuses on the young population, I want to present some context about the youth landscape of Rwanda. In terms of demographics, Rwanda is a very young nation with 40% of population under the age of 14. An analysis of youth unemployment in Rwanda in 2014 revealed that youth makes up a disproportionate share of those who are unemployed or underemployed, which is clearly an important social issue. And more importantly, research showed that there's a mismatch between education level and employment rates. So to some degree, the risk for unemployment is actually higher for those who finish secondary level, which is the equivalent of high school here, versus those who had no formal education. I think this might be indicative of two things. First is the rapidly growing youth population is outpacing the number of jobs that's available. And two, youths who obtain an education are insufficiently trained on the knowledge and technical skill that they need to translate those into viable form of incomes. Moving on to education, the Rwandan government has committed to providing universal basic education. Over 90% of primary school age students are enrolled, making it the highest enrollment rate in Africa. Despite improvement in access, dropout rates are still very problematic. Surveys showing that 70% of youth aged 16 to 30 only obtain a primary education or lower. In rural schools, the low quality of English education, along with the minimal qualification of teacher, really reduces the benefit of schooling. This concerning level of English proficiency among school teachers can be pointed down to the sudden change from French to English as a primary language of instruction in 2008. And personally, I also experienced this firsthand while working with youths up in the Guerrilla Guardian village. Even though everything is taught in English, most of them are unable to communicate fluently or even at an intermediate level. And this really brings into question the effectiveness of the current English-based curriculum in Rwanda. So about my project partner, Guerrilla Guardians Village was founded in 2004 by Edwin Sapuhoro. The idea came about when Edwin was working as a tourism warden at Volcanoes National Park. And while committed to protecting the mountain gorillas from poacher, he also realized that poaching was the result of local people lacking a sustainable means of livelihood. So after spending time researching, talking to and living among local poachers and their family, he helped them set up potato farms in his first project called Turning Poachers to Farmers. Building on the success of this project, he rallied more people from the community to start building the Guerrilla Guardian Cultural Village after realizing that there is a need for tourists to learn more about the Rwandan culture. It started as a community developed project, and GGV is not only a cultural village, but also a nonprofit organization with many initiatives to support reform poachers and local communities through livelihood change. GGV provides clean water, education support, agriculture support, enterprise development through community-based tourism, arts and crafts sale, and many conservation incentives such as boats for Guerrilla. In this initiative, GGV takes donation from tourists visiting the cultural village and uses them to purchase goats for families who suffer from financial hardship in the community. There's also a total of 10 cooperatives that GGV supports with initiatives ranging from growing potatoes, beekeeping, seed growing, arts and craft, or community tourism. Since its inception, Guerrilla Guardian Village has provided support for youth in the communities in many different ways. Firstly, it provides livelihood and economic support for family, which directly helps with youth education and overall well-being. GGV also have a formal partnership with local university. For example, they work with Muhabura Integrated Polytechnic College in Musanze district to provide internship for college students wanting to work in tourism. So these students can come up to the village, shadow the tour guides, they can watch the tour from start to end, and also trying to give a tour themselves under the supervision of a professional guide from GGV. And local youths who want to become future dancer, performers, or guides can also be trained by GGV worker in dancing, drumming, and tourism performance. And this is to prepare these youth with the skill and passion for their future employment, whether it is with GGV or with any other tourism entities. This picture right here that I took was when I was up in the village, and they were just teaching these youths how to dance and perform the cultural dance and everything. So it was pretty fun to watch. So despite all this, GGV has expressed a need to further educate, engage with and support youths in the community through more future programs. So for my study, I will first go over the research need, particularly why it is important to understand the career aspirations of youth living near Volcano National Park. Then we'll go over the study objectives, the methodology, some potential limitation, and the key findings and discussion. So why is the study important? Given the socio-ecological uncertainties facing community near Volcano National Park, as well as the landscape of youth in Rwanda, I believe there's a need and also an untapped opportunity to look into the career aspiration of youth in living near Volcano National Park. With land becoming more scarce, the park expanding, leading to significant loss of lands and livelihoods, the young population soon growing up to become head of households, understanding the livelihood aspiration of the youths, as well as their attitudes toward conservation, will have great implication for sustainable community development and the continued conservation of the park. What's more, the market and employment landscape in Rwanda is rapidly changing. Although agriculture remains the mainstay of the economy, it accounts for a declining share of the country's gross domestic product, lagging behind that of industrial and service sector in recent years. Also, the higher education level means that demands will also be growing for occupation in the formal sectors. All that being said, knowing what barriers youths are facing in accessing the job market will help highlight areas for support, such as skill development or network opportunities. With this study, I want to focus on 3 main objectives. Firstly, it is to understand the attitudes towards different career options of youth, including conservation careers. Secondly, I want to identify potential barriers that they are facing in achieving their livelihood goals. And lastly, to understand what motivated and encouraged young Rwandans conservationists to pursue a career in this field, which can then provide guidelines for conservation education and outreach program. For the first 2 objectives, I use 2 participatory methods. Participatory methods have been proven to increase community participation, engagement, and empowerment by reducing the power dynamic and allowing more interaction between among participants. So I had a sample of 44 youths, aged 14 to 26. They live in nearby villages and were contacted by the Guerrilla Garden Village manager, David, to participate in the research. For the third objective, I employed semi-structured interviews with 5 young Rwandans working in conservation of Volcano National Park to really understand factors that motivate and shape their attitude and career choice. So for the first method, the pair comparison was used to gauge participants' attitudes toward different livelihood options, and it does so by generating a ranking. So how does this work? I have a total of 8 occupation or livelihood options derived from my conversation with local partners and personal observation was presented. There are agriculture, business, tourism and services, environmental conservation, education, healthcare, industrial, and government. Each participant is given a pen and paper form to record their answer. In groups and with the help of translator, I verbally present a pairing of 2 occupations at a time. So for example, I would ask the group, would you prefer to work in agriculture or business? And participant indicated which option they prefer on the form. And this continued until all the 28 pairings was presented. Participants then tally up the responses and produce a ranking from the most chosen answer. So like the occupation that they chose the most time to the least. It is also worth noticing that in most, if not all cases, more than 1 occupation have the same ranking, meaning that they were chosen for the same number of time. So this is a picture of when I did the activity. I also have some pictures printed out of the jobs so that I can show it to them when I ask them the question and they can visualize the question better. And this is the form on the right is the form that I have for them to fill out. Actually, they can circle which jobs they want. And there's 28 pairings that you can see. And lastly is the table with the ranking, or they can put the most chosen options to the least. Next one is the balloons and stone method. It is used to identify what is helping and hindering youths in achieving their career goal. It was originally designed to help community members identify factors that might help or hinder their work or progress towards a goal. The concept is similar to a force field analysis. You can see on this visualization here on the slide. It looked at the factor or forces that either driving movement toward a goal or blocking movement from the goal. However, the visuals of balloons and stone was deployed to make it easier to understand for people with different level of education. Participants will work together and draw a visual diagram similar to the one right here, the picture. So this arrow represent, the arrows in the middle represent their journey towards the goal. The balloons represent things that are helping or supporting them, and the stones represent things that are hindering them from the goal. Participants can work together and discuss among themselves and accordingly write down their answer on the balloons or the stone. This is a picture of the activity that I did. I brought some crayons and like a large sheet of paper so they can work together. I chose this activity as a way to engage youth in a somewhat fun and non-traditional research activity, and also allow them to discuss and exchange ideas with one another. And lastly, I've used semi-structured interviews to understand motivation for conservation attitudes and aspiration of young Rwandans. Participant was recruited through GGV and personal connection that I made while living in Rwanda. They come from a variety of institutions, private company, nonprofit organizations, and even the federal government. The interview was carried out in English. And from these interviews, I hope to compile a different story that can be communicated via storytelling platforms to inspire and encourage more youths to be involved in conservation. And furthermore, understanding these factors will provide valuable tips and lessons for program aiming to engage more youth in conservation activities. Before going to the key findings, I want to acknowledge some limitations that could have impacted the outcome of my study. Even though I was able to obtain information from 44 participants, a larger sample size would have been more desirable and representative. Secondly, it has come to my attention that youths were not familiar with the process of reflecting on their experiences. When I presented them with the task of thinking about what factors are supporting or preventing them from their goals, most participants, including the one with higher level of education, had trouble coming up with answer and needed extra guidance from the translator. Therefore, I feel like the activity did not yield the best results possible, and that extra support could have prevented the data to a certain degree. Another limitation is that the participants' ranking for different options were limited to the 8 options that I provided. However, they came from conversation with partner and local people, and therefore I safely assume that they are considerably exhaustive and relevant to local context. Now we're moving to the key findings. There was a lot of information to be derived from the data collected, but I chose to highlight the strongest and most significant patterns. After coming up with a list of the most significant results, I then triangulated my findings with literature review and also conversation with my project partner and people from local communities to possibly account for the trends and the results that I found. First of all, the most consistent pattern recorded among participants was their disinterest in agriculture as a future livelihood. Out of the 8 options presented, the highest ranking for agriculture is 5, and the lowest is 8, with 8 being the most frequently occurring ranking. The standard deviation is 1, is also lowest across the board, which means there's a really high level of agreement among participants in terms of this ranking. This finding is consistent with many studies and with the socio-economic and ecological changes happening within Rwanda. For instance, as I have mentioned earlier, land scarcity or loss of land is rapidly becoming an issue as a result of population growth and ongoing expansion projects at the park. Modern agriculture also requires funds and knowledge in order to yield the best production. Furthermore, as most households living near Volcano National Park depends on subsistence farming, the low productivity and hard labor associated with this work may discourage them from continuing the family tradition. A research paper presented during the 2019 Conference on Land Policy in Africa highlighted many challenges that rural youths are facing in accessing land ownership, which further accounts for the declining popularity of agriculture among them. And more importantly, research has shown that climate change will disproportionately impact the agriculture sector. According to the Co-op News, from January to June 2018, floods and landslide affected more than 9,000 hectares of crops and caused the death of almost 800 livestock in Rwanda. Since the majority of community near the park rely on subsistence farming, these smallholding farmers will suffer the most since they lack the capacity and capitals to adapt and recover from natural disaster. The next finding, business is the sector with the most occurrences of being ranked first. 68.2% of participants ranked business first and second. This means that they felt very strongly about business as a possible future livelihood. This trend can be explained by the following reasons. First of all, the Rwandan government has many favorable policy and for business owners and startups because they really want to boost the domestic economy. Despite remaining a low-income country, Rwanda has a relatively high ranking on the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. And from conversation with local contacts, it became clear to me that youth also like the idea of owning a business because it is considered highly profitable compared to other sectors, and also of the control that they have over their source of income. Slightly more than half of participants, 52.3%, ranked environmental conservation first and second. Here, the most observable pattern is that the level of interest among female participants is higher than that among male, even though the number of male and female youths participating in the study are not significantly different. It is suggested that more female youths want to participate in conservation since there's not enough representation of females in the field. In reality, there has been a strong desire from the Rwandan government to include more women in the formal sectors. In the absence of male labor following the genocide, the government soon recognized women as key players in the reconstruction and development of the country, and therefore has created many policies to include women in the field that historically lack their representation. Governmental jobs has the second highest times of being ranked first after business. Overwhelmingly, 75% of participants rank it from first to third out of the 8 options. And this can be attributed to the high level of job security and also a good healthcare and retirement plan that comes with a governmental position. And also it is common in the culture that people who work for the government often earn a lot of respect and status within the local community. So from the balloon and stone activity, I concluded with the, oh, what happened to the Zoom? Is it still there? Because it's
it's still viewable on
okay.
Zoom. So I'm not sure what just happened.
Yeah, it disappeared on this.
I don't know what happened on that second screen up there, but you're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
From the balloon and stone activity, I concluded with the following observation with regards to the barriers that youths are facing in achieving their desired livelihood. One, there's a gap between what youths desire, and what they perceive as a realistic career choice. For example, even though agriculture is consistently ranked last or second to last, many explain that they are still doing agriculture in the future simply because it's the most feasible option in the community to generate income. Second, there's a significant concerns about a lack of understanding or knowledge in the respective career fields. There's also a perceived lack of opportunities for recruitment across all occupations. Interestingly, youth mentioned that without knowing the right people or having the right connection, it is very hard for them to secure a future job in their community. Even though education itself is free, youth recognize that school fees and school resources are very common barriers to education, to continuing their education, and thus to securing a future career. And lastly, they express a lack of employable skill, such as language skill and specific job-related skill as a major obstacle to reaching their livelihood goal. So moving on to the results of my interviews, after going through this transcript and analyzing the responses, I was able to identify some overlapping factors that led young Rwandans to a conservation career. First of all participants expressed having family and friends supporting them in their career choice. One of my interviewees working in forestry told me the story of how his mother helped to nurture his passion at a very early age. When he was about 9 years old, he would go out on the field, collect different seeds, and then bring them home to grow and water them. His mom then gave him a small patch of land on their home so that he could plant as many trees as he wants, and that it would be his little forest. With supports from his mother, he then went on to study forestry, which is a not very popular field to go into in Rwanda. And he's now the manager of the bamboo nursery that I mentioned early in the presentation. Another commonality was during their time in school, they was exposed to environmental and nature through school trips and environmental clubs. However, most of them expressed that these trips are very sparing and inconsistent because they depend on contribution from fees from parents, which a lot of time they can't afford it in the community. And many interviewees also reflected on hearing about conservation through friends or acquaintances who are studying or working in the field and feeling really inspired and motivated to follow the same path. Lastly, some of them mentioned that they seeing and learning about nature through different media platforms, such as YouTube videos or watching documentaries on TV. At one point during the interview, I asked them what they thought would help to engage more youth in conservation. All of them brought up the need for more emphasis on the teaching of conservation at school. Another recommendation is to provide more institutional support for environmental management field. For instance, more efforts should be put into developing high quality environmental programs and curriculum, or providing financial incentives for students who are going into conservation, like scholarship or financial aid program. This is one of the comments from a participant. There is a very low number of students studying environmental conservation. The government can change this by showing people an interest and encouraging them to study conservation. If one studies biology and chemistry, in the future he can become a doctor. But when talking about studying forestry, people don't know what they can do in the future. The amount of desire from society to study conservation is not good. And there are also fewer opportunities for financial support for environmental departments in university because it is not the priority of the government. And finally, the concept of nature and environmental clubs should be promoted in school, according to most interviewees, as well as more funding should be channeled into providing students with school trip to natural areas. So clearly, the young generation living near Volcano National Park is showing a very specific trend away from agriculture to more formal and alternative livelihoods. However, they feel uncertain and unprepared to enter the job market with the knowledge and qualification that they currently have. I believe local government and organizations are in an opportune time to start working on more robust program and initiative to equip them with the skill and capitals that they need for livelihood diversification. These programs should focus on addressing the barriers that they have expressed in my study, which can include increased youth access to jobs through accessible job boards and recruitment activities, increase their employability by improving language skills and job-specific skills through education and career workshops. And also, they can create a support system for youth and families who are experiencing hardship in continuing their education. Specifically for Guerrilla Guardian Village, with half of the participants expressing a desire to work in conservation, there is still an opportunity for GGV to start thinking about future education and outreach program focusing on building more conservation awareness and attitudes among youths. This can come in the form of nature workshops, outdoor trips. They can either have viewing of movies and documentary at the cultural village, or have a tree planting day for youths, and so on. So my second suggestion would be for GGV to build an education assistance fund to support students in their community with school fees and other education costs. So similar to the Goats for Guerrilla programs that they're already running, where parts of donation from tourists are used to purchase goats and donated for family with financial hardship, or part of the donation can also be dedicated to this fund to support youth and school-age children in the community. And lastly, I highly recommend GGV to expand its partnership base with other local conservation and education nonprofits. Within proximity to the national park, there are a lot of conservation organizations, both at international and local level, that GGV can seek partnership and collaboration from. So some international one are the Dian Fossey Guerrilla Fund, the African Wildlife Foundation. Some local ones are Nature Rwanda, Conservation Heritage, or Red Rock Initiative, another community tourism-based organization that also does a lot of education and skill development for youth. From being in the field and talking to GGV manager, I realized that there is currently not a lot of partnership that GGV have with local organizations. And because they are so dependent on funds from tourism activities, which can fluctuate greatly from year to year, I think GGV will benefit tremendously from partnering with these organizations in terms of not only funding capacity, but also program outreach, conservation expertise, and so many more. Local school is also a great partner for GGV to collaborate on things like workshop, outdoor trips, and any education and outreach program that they hope to reach a large audience of youths. And with the soon to be completed Ellen DeGeneres campus, it's located only about 15 minutes drive away from Guerrilla Guardian Village. I believe this also opens up a lot of opportunity for future partnership and collaboration. And now for some personal reflection. During my capstone project, I learned a great deal about living and doing research cross-culturally. But the first thing is the importance of piloting, and also something that I wish I had taken more seriously. As someone who's not familiar with doing research, I never experienced firsthand why it's so important to pilot your methods. For example, with the pair comparison activity, I originally had participants writing down their answer instead of circling the options for each comparison. But after the first round, I realized that this format has some issues because a lot of youths have very hard, ineligible handwriting, and a lot of them even misspell words, even though the activity, the form was translated into Kinyarwanda, which is their official language. Yeah, I later changed to a format that worked better, but it did cost me some responses that could have been prevented with piloting. And even with the balloon and stone activities that I mentioned earlier, if I had done some piloting, I would have been able to gauge their level of comfort and comprehension with the activity and made some appropriate changes. But all in all, it was still a pretty hard time to actually do some piloting given the pandemic, because it was also because of the location of GGV, the villages are very fragmented. So in order for us to gather youth to come to do the study, David, the manager, would go tell some youths, and then they go tell another, and then they go tell some more. And that's how we got the participants. And another very important lesson that I learned was managing between expectation and reality. So in other words, asking myself whether I should stick to the plan or just go with the flow. For example, my original plan was to keep participants in smaller groups of 5 or 10 to make sure that they were doing all the social distancing that needed, and also for easier communication between the researcher, the translator, and the participant. But in reality, we did not expect that we would have 30 youths showing up at the same time. And after consulting with David, we decided not to stick with the plan, because that would mean, sending some of them home, which they live pretty far away, or just keeping them there and wait till their turn, which is not very ideal. And luckily, they were all wearing masks, and we had enough room at the cultural village for them to spread out. But a larger group made it harder for some participants to keep up with the pace as we were going through all the 28 pairings. And as a result, some of them were inaccurate, like they would miss a question and then they would just write something down because they didn't want to leave it blank. And so a handful of responses were unusable, which was unfortunate. And I also realized the importance of expressing my gratitude in a very appropriate and genuine way. So after talking to David, I expressed I expressed that I wanted to do something to show my gratitude and to send my thanks to the kids. And after talking to David, we decided that I would spend some of my money on buying them notebooks and pens for youth who participate in my study. I did not tell them this before the start of the study to prevent any potential biases. But I was glad that I found a way to thank them for their time and efforts while also offering some practical support, something that they can actually use and put toward their future goal. Reflecting more on the living culturally side, here are a few lessons that I found super helpful during my time in Rwanda. The first one is taking this time to understand the culture and get to know the people. This picture on the right here is a very traditional game that is played by many Rwandans, from young people to old people. Basically, you have two people sitting on opposite sides. And it's very hard to explain in one sitting, but basically you do a lot of counting, and you want to make sure that you count enough so that you land on a space that opposite from two holes of your opponent. And if they have beans in both of those holes, then you can steal all of them. But basically, there's a lot of counting and quick math. Yeah, quick math involved. And it's pretty strategic when you get to the hang of it. So every time I go up to the GGV, I see them play this all the time when they don't have any tourists visiting the village. And I really wanted to learn it because I was curious, and if they can learn it, I can learn it too. And once I got the basic rules down, I could play and I could really connect with the people in a very special way, especially those who cannot speak English very well. These two pictures right here is when I participated in a cultural festival week at Red Rocks, one of the organizations that I mentioned earlier. I was learning how to dance, how to do the drums, make banana beer and banana paper, making bracelet. And it was really one of the highlights of my time in Rwanda. Another thing that I'm sure goes without saying is to utilize the resources and relationships that you can find or make. For me, these were the local and foreign friends that I made along the way, or even social media groups of foreigners who are living and working in Rwanda. These friendship and resources was like my home away from home, and they were my support system that made it a lot easier for me to adapt to the new culture and new living environment. And last but not least, I really want to hone in on this last piece about flexibility and resilience. I did not arrive in Rwanda until the beginning of July. And as you may or may not have heard it from last week's presentation of Lauren and Summer, we were caught among a nationwide lockdown that started after mid-July. And obviously you can see why I was, feeling all concerned, nervous, unsure about what my next step was going to look like. But I decided to make adjustment to my plan. And in the meantime, just waiting it out to see if the situation would hopefully get better. And after talking to Brett and taking in his advice, I added that interview portion to my method, which was something that I could do during the stay-at-home order. And thankfully, the lockdown ended after about 2 weeks, and I was able to proceed with my original plan. So with some flexibility, resilience, and a bit of stubbornness, I was able to carry out my project as planned, and honestly had the best experience that I could have asked for in Africa. And that's the end of my presentation. This is the reference list. And if you have any question, I'll be happy.